Good morning. Okay, so maybe the best news at all, for you guys anyway. This is our last class. Our last class on Old Testament survey. There's a handout going around. Michael's just passing those out and whatnot. But so this is our last class. So I would say for Rick and I both, we've certainly appreciated this. Rick and I were talking privately, just to me anyway, it seems like kind of personal study. We get into the narratives, the individual narratives of the Old Testament. And so this has been helpful for me in staying at a big macro view about seeing how all the various connection points of the Hebrew Scriptures are woven together, culminating in what's coming. Culminating in what's coming in the Gospels. And so this past Wednesday night, we talked about all the various connection points from Genesis all the way through the prophets and how, again, God's plan of salvation, starting back in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, the fall of man, and how the perfect fellowship man had with God was broken. And since that time, God, in His providence, His wisdom, His redemption, His grace, His mercy, has provided a plan of salvation to the people of old by way of promises, by way of an original covenant with Abraham, repeated to David, so on and so forth, all the way up to, we know what's coming in the Gospels. So, again, I've enjoyed it. Hopefully you guys have gotten a little something out of it. Rick and I both have. Thank you for all your comments, observations, comments, questions, encouragement along the way. So very much appreciated there. Okay, so we have one final lesson. That's today. We're going to talk about the time between the Testaments here. We're going to close it out by talking about the time between the Testaments. At the end of really Nehemiah, Malachi time period up to the Gospels. Mark, probably the first Gospel, but yeah, the Synoptic Gospels. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So there's a handout going around. Maybe the first activity, there's a big typo. I'll let you try to find that. Mike, yeah, you already found it? Okay, good. There's a big typo on the front of it, too. It's called the silent years. There's your hint. Silent years, which is really a misnomer, guys. A lot of things happened during this about 400-year time period from, again, where the Old Testament closes with Malachi before Matthew chapter 1. A lot of things happened. From a political perspective, from a social perspective, from just a change management perspective, there's a lot that's packed in here. Now I want to be clear here. What we're going to talk about today, again, it's silent because we don't have it recorded in Scripture, so let's be clear here. Not inspired, but there are various sources that we can paint together at least a partial narrative of what happened in the land of Israel, what happened to the Jews during this particular period of time. The Jewish historian Josephus writes about it pretty exclusively, or extensively, I should say is a better term. We have a book called the Book of the Maccabees, which talks about it. And we also have, you think about Israel and the neighbors that surrounded Israel. These other nations documented in written form the history of what happened in these particular points as well. So my point is, if we take all that together, we can at least have a pretty good view, again, of what happened to the Jews, what happened to Israel during this particular point. Second thing I want to be really clear on. It is my opinion, and I think you guys would probably agree, we don't have to know what happened in this 400-year period in order to understand God's plan of salvation or to understand the significance behind Jesus coming. I think we've seen that already through our study of the entire Old Testament. So we don't have to know what happened for sure during these 400 years. But I do think there's an advantage of doing that, because you could say, Jordan, then why even talk about it? Well, why even look at it? I do think it gives us perspective and context. It gives us perspective and context to understand the world that Jesus entered into in the Gospels. And so that's why Rick and I, when we were kind of putting together this kind of material and whatnot, we thought, hey, that may be helpful to think about. It's probably not something we talk about that much. I'm just personally, just anecdotally, I should say, again, the time between the Testaments. And so we throw that in here. No extra charge, obviously. But again, we'll close out with this morning. And then Wednesday night, we're starting a new study. I think Bill Mann and John Moon are starting the book of Esther here on Wednesday. Make sense? Okay. There's no getting around it. We got to jump into some history this morning, folks. Now, as I understand, that may not be everyone's most favorite subject. But stick with me. I promise you at the end, we'll make some application points and bring things together. Sound good? Okay. Really, if you think about it, we'll go past these slides. We've seen these before. When you finish up, so pretend for a second that we've just, we've graduated our Hebrew scholarship. We finished the Old Testament, and we're about to read the Old New Testament for the first time. I'm going to guess we probably can't get 20 pages in without some big questions coming up. The way we leave things in the Old Testament versus where we pick them up in the New Testament, there's some big differences or questions we might have. And so what I've done this morning is identify, there's tons of them out there. I put together what I would call maybe the big five, or the big observations or questions we would ask when reading the New Testament that as when we in the Old Testament we don't necessarily see those answers. Here's my point. Here's the questions. Okay. Why is everyone speaking Greek? That's a little bit different. Didn't necessarily see that when we closed the Old. When I say everyone, there are also regional dialects, but Greek is being the prominent language at this particular point in time. This is a big one to me, I think, maybe for you too. Why do many of the New Testament individuals, the apostles, the disciples, including Jesus, when they give quotes about the Old Scriptures, they're quoting from a book written in Greek? That seems somewhat interesting, if not significant. Who are the people in power call themselves the Romans? Yeah, what happened with that? This is a good one too. I'm sorry. What's a Pharisee? What's a Sadducee? Zealots, scribes, Essenes. We don't necessarily see that. The Jewish sects, S-E-C-T-S. That's something new. And then my personal favorite, maybe a little bit. What's a synagogue? Right? So we don't necessarily see that in the Old Testament, but then we get to the New Testament, and synagogues are everywhere to a certain degree. Very prominent and part of the Gospels, or the book of Acts, I should say. Of course, Paul, a lot of his missionary work was done, started at synagogues and so forth. And so our plan this morning, let's go through and talk about these kind of five big questions, because several of these we actually see, and it harmonizes itself with the Gospels. Does that make sense? Just from a contextual perspective, the big questions here? Okay. So let's work through these together. So maybe I'll ask you guys, why is everyone speaking Greek? Brian? I think I've heard of him. It is.
It's a Gentile language that has so many descriptive terms in it. It's far more versatile than the Hebrew language, and that's why they're speaking Greek.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. I mean, it was beneficial, I would say, and we're going to get kind of culmination of how these things are beneficial to the gospel. But no, Brian's exactly right. Alexander the Great. We've probably heard of him. Go back to high school history, maybe college history and whatnot. In 334, Alexander the Great came onto the scene, 334 BC, I should say. Let me clarify, BC. Came onto the scene and really conquered the Persian Empire, really, Brian, is what it was. Conquered the known world, huge empire. And one of Alexander's, call it maybe missions, if you will, was to adopt the Greek culture everywhere he went. The Greek culture, the Greek language, the Greek worldviews to a certain degree. And by the way, he conquered ancient Israel. But if you recall, Alexander died fairly young. This was in 323 BC. He died in Babylon, and what happened was he didn't have successors at that point, so his vast, vast empire was broken up into various generals. Two of them play a pretty big role as it relates to ancient Israel. One was the Ptolemies, that's spelt with a P. Riddle me that. It starts with a P. The Ptolemies, that was down in ancient Egypt. Okay? General Ptolemy, his region, he started a dynasty down in ancient Egypt. The Seleucids were just above Israel. So we're talking modern-day Syria, Asia Minor, and whatnot. And so Alexander dies, the kingdom's broken up. Israel then is under the domain, if you want to call it that, under the Ptolemies in Egypt. And things are actually pretty well for the people at that particular point in time. They were kind of left alone to a certain degree, so it really wasn't that big of a deal. But as we all know, things change, and things change quite drastically. On the Seleucids, northern part of Israel, north of Israel, I should say, a new leader of them came to power. You may have heard of him. He's pretty famous. Yes, well done, Brian. Well done. Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV, whose full name is Theos Epiphanes, which means, this may be descriptive of how he thought of himself, which means God made manifest. Antiochus IV. And so what happened was, ambitious guy wanted to conquer more of Alexander, kind of the broken empire, if you will. And so he adopted a very, very radical Hellenistic view. Very, very radical. And so what he did was, he went down to Egypt and conquered the Ptolemies. Conquered the Ptolemies, declared himself, I am the new emperor, I am the new leader, this vast expansion of his kingdom. Where it gets interesting, though, is on his way back home to get there, to get from Egypt to kind of northern Syria, what do you have to do? You got to go through Israel. You got to go through Israel. Here's what happened, though. So this is 170 BC. In response to this more radical view of Hellenization, when I say radical, what he did was he outlawed a lot of the Hebrew worship. He tried to get rid of the copies of the Hebrew Torah, the Hebrew law and whatnot. On his way back up through Jerusalem, there was this kind of mini revolt, if you want to call it that. The Jews didn't take kindly of that. And so what Antiochus IV did is he utterly plundered Jerusalem and specifically the temple. So if you may remember this, two big things he did that were just horrific with the temple. One, the temple in Jerusalem, right? The temple, God's temple. One, he rededicated it to the Greek god Zeus. Built a new altar, put it on top of the Hebrew altar there in the temple. And the second, does anybody know what the second big thing it is? He sacrificed a specific animal in the temple. Do y'all know what it is? A pig, yeah. Secular history tells us he sacrificed a pig in the temple in Jerusalem. How do you think the Jews felt about that? No, not at all, Dan, as you mentioned. Not at all. And so what happened, what turned into kind of more of a demonstration, is what history tells us, turned out to be a full-fledged revolt. Full-fledged revolt. Outside of Jerusalem, in a small village, there was a man. Himself, he was an elderly man. He had 5 sons. His name was Mattathias. He had 5 sons, just outside of Jerusalem. What they did as a result of this pig being sacrificed in the temple is they tore down the Greek altar there in their village, and they killed Antiochus IV's local representative. So now we're talking kind of full-on rebellion started to happen. And what they did was, him and his sons, they escaped into the mountains of Ephraim, the Judean mountains, and really staged a rebel movement, if you want to call it that. The old man, Mattathias, he died shortly after it started. Again, he had 5 sons. One of his sons became the leader. His name was Judas. He was also called Maccabees. So that term, Maccabees, or that name, means the hammer. It's kind of cool. The hammer. He was called the hammer. But that's where we get, from historical, secular history, the Maccabean revolts. The Maccabean revolts. So this happened during the time of these silent years, time between the Testaments. So they started this rebel movement, had some initial success, had some defeats and failures, but maybe providence was on their side, because Antiochus IV, he couldn't devote fully to this rebellious movement down in Israel, because a new power was coming onto the scene that was putting pressure on him from the west, moving from west to east. Who do you think that was? Brian shakes his hand. Rome. Rome was coming. And so Antiochus IV, hey, I've got this kind of rebel movement going on in ancient Israel, but a bigger issue is, hey, I'm in Syria up here. These Roman people are getting on my doorstep and whatnot. So really what happens is he kind of, to a certain degree, abandons this rebel movement down in Israel. And so, in the year I think it was 135, actually. Don't quote me on that. I think it's 135. Maccabees reconquers Jerusalem, rededicates the temple, not to Zeus, but to the Hebrew God, Yahweh, restarts back up the sacrificial elements that went into the keeping of the law, so on and so forth. That's in 165. I take that back. It's 165 is whenever that was done. This anniversary, here's a second fun fact for this morning. This anniversary is still celebrated today, of him retaking Jerusalem and rededicating the temple. Depending upon where we are, which year it is, either happens very late November or very early December. It lasts for 8 days. What's it called? Hanukkah. Hanukkah, yeah. So Hanukkah, we're talking, predates Jesus by about 150 years. Okay, so moving on here, and again, we won't take much time on the rest of these questions, and we'll relate it back to scriptures, but it's important to know the context. So during this particular point in time, the fifth son of this man, this elderly man in the village, kind of started this rebellion, if you will. The other 4 sons died, including Maccabees. The youngest son was named Simon. And so they were from a priestly family, the Levite tribe specifically, and so Simon becomes high priest and then starts his own kind of mini dynasty, if you will, a ruler in Jerusalem. And so this was pretty significant. I wouldn't say Israel is its own, kingdom or anything like that, but it's more kind of a, people left them alone to a certain degree, and so they had this kind of semi-autonomous type of organization is probably the better way to think of it. But during this time, when that happened, again, Greek became de facto. Even in spite of all these different kind of movements and social reforms and conquerings and things like that, Greek became the de facto language, the de facto culture to a certain degree. One interesting fact that we read about a lot in the Gospels, the Sanhedrin. So it is at this particular point in time, so during this Maccabean period, this dynasty called the Hezmanian Dynasty, that the Sanhedrin is established. Now, what do we remember about the Sanhedrin? Okay, yeah. On multiple occasions, Jesus, his apostles, early disciples had some run-ins, we'll say it loosely, with the Sanhedrin. What was the Sanhedrin, though, like organization? What was it? Y'all know? Yes, yeah, both of you guys, Albert and Robert. Yes. So it was a council. That's what's called the Sanhedrin. It was a council of 70 Jewish elders. Technically 71, because the high priest chaired the Sanhedrin. So we read about Sanhedrin quite a bit in the Gospels. This is where it started there in this particular point in time. One of the interesting things, though, so why did they come up with the Sanhedrin? It's assumed, and I think pretty accurately assumed, that this was in response in Exodus chapter 24. God told Moses, quote, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel." And so, again, the Sanhedrin, Brian, someone alluded to a second ago, was or actually Albert did, was the authority at this particular point in time from a religious perspective, from a civil perspective, from a social perspective. This was like the governing elite council, if that makes sense. You guys still with me? That was a lot of history. Sorry. Okay. All that to say, from a contextual perspective. That's why when you open the New Testament, Greek is this predominant language, culture, things of that nature. Question 2, which again relates back to question 1. Why then, well, I should say why then, why do various New Testament authors, when they quote the Old Testament, they're quoting from a Greek book? Maybe question 1 I should ask. What book am I referring to? The Septuagint. And what is the Septuagint, Brian? What is the Septuagint?
The Old Law.
Translated into what?
In Greek.
In Greek.
Written in Alexandria. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Greek translation of the Old Testament. Where we got there, I think Brian used to allude to it, actually. We got to go back to, again, back a couple years, Alexandria. So, Alexander the Great dies. Kingdom is broken up. We just talked about the Ptolemies, again, down in Egypt, starts with letter P. The Ptolemies down in Egypt. They built a city called Alexandria, which really became the pinnacle of all things Greek. All things Greek. Culture, language, that's what it was at. And what happened was a lot of displaced peoples from all over the empire that was just broken up migrated to Alexandria. If you recall, one of the ancient wonders of the world was the library at Alexandria. And so Ptolemy II is very, he likes his library. He likes this type of things. And so he has a request. And his request is he wants a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures, but obviously you want it in Greek. This is Alexandria, for crying out loud, right? So what he does is he asks the high priest in Jerusalem to send men to translate your law, your prophets and, the law and the prophets, I should say, into Greek. And so the high priest obliges. He sends 72 individuals, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to Alexandria. They undertake the task, and they translate the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, into Greek. In fact, the term, the Septuagint, means the 70, referencing, again, how many people translated it. So my question is, okay, why is a lot of the apostles, Paul in particular, in fact, I shouldn't say every time, but almost every time Paul quotes the Old Testament in his epistles, it's always the Septuagint. Why do you think that is? Well, maybe I shouldn't say why, but what are the ramifications of that, you think? The takeaways, let's call it. Brian?
Number one, that the old law is passing away, so we got the new language, which is the cultural and commercial language of the civilized world at that time.
Yep.
And that's my guess.
I think that's fair. Mike?
If you're going to spread the gospel to all the world, Hebrew is not going to be the way to do it. You need to get it in a language that more people know, which, as you rightly said, is Greek at this particular point.
At this juncture, that's the de facto. Yeah. Robert?
He's also establishing that this is okay to be an authoritative translation from the Old Hebrew into Greek because his apostles who are inspired are referring back to it.
So thank you for all your comments. So those are the two things I had too as well. One, just from a reliability perspective, to your point, Robert, at this particular time, it's widely, I shouldn't say assumed, but I guess I can't think of a better word. It's widely assumed this is completely credible. Jesus himself quoted this, so the reliability of it, I think, can't be missed. And then two, from a providential perspective, this tees up things very nicely. That's what's about to happen here in the next couple hundred years. Brian?
Yeah, I don't know what verse it is, but it says that Jesus came in the fullness of time. He doesn't say when the fullness is, but what we obviously have under Rome is you've got the Greek language of the world that you can communicate, the transportation system, and the communication system.
Yep. Hold that thought, Brian. In 15 minutes, we're going to go to Galatians. I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. But anyway, so again, I think that's interesting. Again, the text of the Greek Old Testament is quoted more often than the original Hebrew Bible text in the Greek New Testament. Right? That's kind of a play on words there. The Greek New Testament is quoted more often, or excuse me, is quoting the Greek Old Testament more than the Hebrew Old Testament, which is interesting. I almost have to get a diagram to kind of figure out how that works. But anyway, okay. Any final questions about that? Thoughts about that? We're going to bring this all together. Albert.
Wonder or suppose if the Jewish leaders are becoming more and more seclusive and exclusive to where folks aren't able to get access to it, as we see in New Testament, they are isolated from their fellow Jewish folks, to where the common was more readily available.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and there is speculation about that. I mean, there's also speculation about, did that many people at this particular juncture read, write, and speak Hebrew? There's some speculation about that. That was maybe a minority of the population did. Of course, there's other regional dialects, Aramaic, the everyday language of Jesus, obviously, and whatnot. So I think there could be something there as well. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. Who are the Romans? Right? So I think this maybe we know this story probably pretty well. If everybody's speaking Greek, and Greek is the de facto language, then who are these Roman characters? So Rick kind of teed this up when he was talking about the prophets, that, and I should have mentioned at the beginning of this lesson too, that there were still prophecies that happened that actually were fulfilled in this silent years period as well. And so Brian, you alluded to it, but then Rick talked about it. I think it was Daniel, don't quote me, I think it's chapter 7 if I recall, but look that up. That talks about these world powers and what's going to happen, and specifically leading to the fullness of time, that, as we'll talk about as well. And so Rome was a part of that. So what happened was, and again, maybe high school, college history, put your hat on here. In 77 BC, there was a young Roman commander named Pompey, who really made it his mission to expand Rome in a huge way. And so what he did was he led various campaigns into Asia Minor, including Israel. And so what happened was, really, Israel at that juncture, this is about 60, 70 years before the birth of Christ, really became then a Roman province. In fact, in 48 BC, Julius Caesar, who again we're familiar with from history and whatnot, who was made Caesar and Lord of all Rome, took Judea under his a providence designation. That's in 63 BC. 63 BC. So here's where it gets interesting as relates to the Gospel according to Matthew. What Caesar did was he appointed 2 brothers to be governors in Israel. And the names you may be familiar with. Faisal, brother named Faisal, was in charge. He was the governor of Jerusalem. And his brother named Herod, remember that, Herod was governor of Galilee. What happened, though, because I think we all remember, well, why is Herod up in Galilee? We don't see Herod in Galilee in the Scriptures. Here's what happened. So, right before the birth of Christ, I shouldn't say right before, I think it was around 40 BC, what happened was a new regional power, I shouldn't say new, but the Parthians came from the east to the west. They're from modern-day Iran. They came and invaded Jerusalem. And so Faisal, who's the governor, the brother, right, he kills himself as part of the siege and whatnot. And what does Herod do? Herod gets up out of Galilee. He runs off to Rome. He runs off to Rome, escapes to Rome, because these new people are now in Judea, in ancient Israel. While he's in Rome, it is Caesar, it is Rome who declares to Herod, you are now going to be king of Judea. And we read about the king of Judea here in the Scriptures. He's given that title while in Rome. He's given a couple Roman legions, and they sent him back to Jerusalem to retake this Roman province of Jerusalem and Judea. This is the Herod. This is the Herod that we read about at the birth of Jesus. He was not Jewish. He was an Edomite. So if he's going to be king of the Jews, what do you think a logical thing to do would be? I should probably marry someone who is Jewish. And so that's what he did. He married, I'm going to butcher this name, I think it's Marami. Anyway, she is the last of the Hezmanians we talked about, right? The Maccabees revolt and whatnot. She's kind of the last, or one of the last of that kind of dynasty, if you will. And so he married her to give credibility that I am king of the Jews. And he ruled for 37 years in Jerusalem. It was him during the birth of Jesus. He did a lot of great things for the Jewish people at this juncture, at this particular time. Most of it more building projects, if you're familiar. One of the biggest things that we know about, he's the one, we call it Herod's temple. He's the one that expanded the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So again, the temple was there. It was rebuilt, the walls, Zerubbabel, Nehemiah around the walls of the city and whatnot, the remnant coming back from captivity. But Herod is the one that really expanded the temple compound, beautified it. He built hippodomes, he built academies, he built water systems, he built Caesarea. That comes to be a pretty big port city, specifically with the spread of the gospel and whatnot. So my point is, he did a lot of good archaeological, or I should say projects-wise, things for the Jews. But here's the point, though. He was hated. He was hated by the Jews because two things. One, he was a foreigner. You're our king, but you're not Hebrew. And two, he was a puppet of the Romans. And so it is he, in order to preserve power, commanded that all babies should be killed at the birth of Jesus there in Bethlehem. Make sense? Okay. All right. Let's move on then. And talk about, okay, so Jewish sects here. Again, it's somewhat, imagine you're reading the Gospels for the first time. You put your hat on, it's like, wait, what? Who are these people? So what were the various Jewish sects? Obviously, I listed two of them up here. There's probably 5 or 6 of them. There's Pharisees, Sadducees. You may remember some of the other ones that are used? I'm sorry? The Essenes, Brian, yep. Well done. The Essenes, we'll come back to those in a second, are interesting because that term is not found in the New Testament, actually. The Essenes are not listed as a sect, but historically, Josephus writes about them a ton at this particular point in time. So the Essenes, what else? The Zealots being another one, Steve. So my point is, that there's various groups, if you will, or factions. So again, Sadducees, the Pharisees are probably the most common ones we're familiar with, had the most run-ins, if you will, with Jesus and the early disciples. What was the main difference between the Pharisees and Sadducees? Y'all remember? Okay. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest difference, Dan, the biggest one. Pharisees believed in the resurrection. Sadducees did not. In fact, now that I look at that, Mike helped me out. Sadducees may be spelt wrong up there as well. So anyway. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Dan. It goes a little bit more to that, though. That's absolutely correct. It's probably the biggest one. The Pharisees were more, I think maybe Rick, you mentioned this in a previous lesson, were more legalistic in their interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the law. They were often called separatists, if you will, being set apart. Hey, we're not mainstream here. We are devoted to the law, which seemingly is probably why Jesus has some very blunt responses to some of their questions about, hey, you say that the Scriptures and that you're this true to the law itself, but you're missing some of the basic ideological principles of what the law even spoke about. Sadducees, you're right, Dan, denied the resurrection of the dead. They claim that the soul does not exist, and therefore after death no one expects to suffer, good or bad, at all. Steve, you mentioned the Zealots, I think, back there in the back. That's kind of a newer one, if you will. I say newer. Not from a historical perspective, not as round as much as the Sadducees, the Pharisees. And then, Brian, as you mentioned, the Essenes. Again, the Essenes, we don't see that term in the New Testament or the Old Testament for that matter. But here in modern day, they become more popular. because some things that were found in 1946, and what were they, Brian? What they found? Yep, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls. It's thought that the scrolls were a part of the Essenes library, if you will. The Essenes were more of a, we say Pharisees were separatists. The Essenes were more like communal, like living out away from society in the wilderness. And again, the Dead Sea Scrolls were thought to be written by them. And some of those Dead Sea Scrolls, guys, I don't know if they travel in the U.S. here quite a bit. I think Jamie and I, we saw them up in Dallas once. But then in Israel, there's a good collection of them as well. It's very, very interesting stuff. The scriptures going back, some of them go back to, I want to say 300 BC, which is interesting. Okay, any other thoughts about that? Questions? Yeah. There's some thoughts that that's part of it, Steve. There was more of kind of a merging, if you will, between that. I don't know if definitively if we can say that with
Against Herod, I suppose.
They were. So it appears, thank you, I should have expanded. Thank you, Steve. It appears the Zealots were more, how to say it the right way? We want to be different in terms of law, but they took it maybe a little more political as well than maybe the Pharisees and the Sadducees as well. Against Herod, against Roman occupation to a certain degree, but that's probably everyone in that time period. But yeah, they seemed to be, they had a little more of the political undertones as part of their ideology than just simply difference in law, difference in resurrection and non-resurrection. So yeah, good point. Guys, I promise you, we're going to bring all this together. We're bringing all this together. Just guys, stick with me here. Okay. One of my personal favorites. What is a synagogue? I guess maybe I missed that somewhere along the way in the Old Testament. What's a synagogue? Because we see those all over the New Testament. What's a synagogue? Brian.
I'll have to go back to the deepest part of my memories. I was thinking synagogues actually got started during the captivity, but you had Jews all over the world, and so they created churches, if you will, places to assemble to read the Torah and practice their religion.
Yep. The term's not used in the Old Testament. Now, to your point, from a practical perspective, maybe it became a term, if you will. No, I think that's. Any other thoughts or ideas? Okay, there was some organization to it. Lucille mentions. Yeah, that's good. You know, the true answer is maybe all of us would say we don't know. Maybe to a certain degree. I'm with Brian. It does seem like synagogues became. Let me be clear. They're probably different than what we typically think of synagogues today. I don't know about you guys. When I was in high school, we played basketball at the Jewish Synagogue Rec Center all the time. I think that's a little bit different than probably what the synagogues that we see in the New Testament. It seems to be more of a communal place, a gathering place, where different prayers, discussions, maybe debates, maybe the reading, I shouldn't say maybe, the reading of the law, the Torah, things like that took place. Some have suggested, Brian, and contradictory to kind of your point though, some have suggested that the synagogues really became more prominent after the destruction of the temple in AD 70 by the Romans. I think that's probably unlikely for the fact that we see synagogues before 70 AD. But I do think it's worth pointing out, it seems to be the temple is where the worship, the sacrificial elements that were carried out by the priest and whatnot, it seems to be that the synagogues were probably more small, maybe small groups, maybe is the best way to think about that. A place of prayer, a place of coming together, discussion, study, praying, reading of the Torah, things like that. It does seem, though, to give credibility, that after the destruction of the temple, they do turn into the de facto places of worship, to Lucille's point. Again, that's in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. Does that make sense? Synagogue, it's an interesting one. It means house of assembly. which maybe speaks to your point, Brian. That term is used 56 times in the New Testament, mainly in the Synoptic Gospels, Gospel of John, Book of Revelation, and then Paul references it quite frequently. Okay. That's about, 430 years of history. I think maybe I'll know this. I like history. I'm a history buff. And again, as Jamie constantly reminds me, Jordan, not everyone likes history, and that's okay. Here's my point, though. Why is this relevant? So as we close out this study of the Old Testament, looking forward to what's going to happen in the New, why would this stuff be relevant? And Brian kind of went there. Steve, elaborate for us.
Well, I can just say that it's the perfect environment for the spread of Christianity, I think. In other words, the ground was fertile.
Yep.
At that time, not only politically, but socially, I think. So that would be the answer I'd give.
Yep. No, I think you're right. Brian, to the verse you mentioned, and Steve, no, I think you're spot on. Galatians 4, verse 4. When the fullness of time had come, maybe I put this up here, maybe I didn't. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son. So my question then would be, what does Paul mean by that? What does he mean by the fullness of time? You can make a pretty strong argument, I think. We've talked about the fullness of time for the last 8 weeks or however long we've been going through the Old Testament, right, Rick? That again, it all started with the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3, and everything has been building upon that, about this fullness of time that Jesus is coming, God's redemption plan. God's going to extend His mercy. God's going to send His grace in a magnificent way, and that is leading us to Jesus. I think there's something there. I think Rick and I have tried to make that point about all these different connection points, how it's all leading to Jesus, no matter which section of the Old Testament we're looking at. I do think, though, Steve, to your point, these other kind of situational issues is part of Paul's definition about the fullness of time. History shows that Christ's coming was an opportune moment, the right moment. During these silent years, again, Alexander the Great came on the scene, imposing and unifying influence of Greek culture and language, to your point, Mike, followed by the Romans, their excellent road systems, their governmental structure, overall peaceful order, just right for the spreading of the gospel really over 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And it's interesting, I think, that this period of time, the birth of Christ, this to really about the next 200 years, is considered to be the Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. This was a time of relative peace and stability in the Roman Empire. Obviously, persecution, that's a separate issue. But in terms of wars and things like that, relative peace. And it was the absolute great time, some would say perfect time, the providence of God, for Jesus to come onto the scene and the gospel to flourish and be carried to all these different lands in a unified way. To me, that is so encouraging, uplifting, and impactful. Again, we'll close where we started this morning. I don't think we need to know exactly what happened these 400 years, but I do think having an idea of what it might have been like based on the secular history, it gives us confidence, even more perspective, even more context that God's plan of salvation, that God knows more than we know, and His plan has been at work since the beginning. And all that's required of us is, again, the looking forward. Just like the people of old, they were looking forward to the Savior, this King. And I would argue we are also looking forward, not for His first coming, but for the second coming as well. Does that make sense? Any thoughts, observations, questions as or anything we've talked about for that matter over this, 8 weeks, 6-8 weeks, whatever it was? Mike?
Well, I think in general, the study that we've been through, plus the times that you're talking about, are very definitive. Nothing happened by chance. Everything had a end goal to it. And so, to me, that part is comforting, because since the beginning of time, if nothing has happened perchance, then that's telling me that going from here forward is not going to be perchance either, So that is comforting to me on that particular point.
Thanks, Mike. That's a good point. Who are we to say then, oh, now it's going to start being random? Okay, right. Yeah. Anything final? Good. Hey, I've appreciated it. Rick has appreciated it as well. We've talked about it privately and whatnot. Thank you for everything, and looking forward to Esther on Wednesday.